So lately I have been reading about the Lebanese Civil War. I've been reading this book called Pity the Nation by Robert Fisk. I am done with over 300 pages and I have over 300 more pages to go. This book is almost 700 pages in total. But I must say that it is a difficult book to read. When I first began reading the book, I found it to be very exciting, riveting, and graphic. And now, as I peruse through the pages, I find it more and more difficult to read through this book because it is so damn horrifying. Robert Fisk does a very good job in expressing in almost a poetic fashion the graphic, bloody, and cruel details of war. The complete disregard for human life, the screams and the wails of civilians as they find loved ones dead on the street, babies dead on the streets, husbands, wives buried underneath rubble after aerial bombs. Complete and utter horror. It makes you feel very, very humble to live a comfortable life. We bitch and complain when the fax machine isn't working, or we don't use fax machines anymore, when the scanner isn't working. We complain when the food in the restaurant doesn't come on time. We bitch and complain at the lady who works behind the window because it took too long to bring the food over in the drive-thru. We complain when justice is done. We complain when criminals are given their due justice. We complain when, this politician didn't do what he said he was going to do, but yet we, at the same time, in the midst of all of this, do not understand suffering. We do not fully comprehend suffering. What is suffering? This book, my God, this book by Robert Fisk has forced me to deeply meditate on suffering. I like to read at night. I know a lot of people talk about reading in the morning. When you wake up in the morning, read. But I love to read at night. There's something about just sitting down at nighttime when everything is quiet and you hear the crickets cricketing, and you hear the wind, and you hear the owls howling or woo woo, and you just sit down and you read a book. And you just have a couple of hours in the night to read about history, to read about the realities of the world. People like to mock reading. They'll say, well, you're reading all those damn books. Back in my day, I had to walk 8,000 miles to get to school or something like that. You're reading these damn books. But I think the problem with a lot of people is that they don't read good material. A lot of people read, but they read garbage. They read Harry Potter. And yes, a lot of people read Harry Potter, even though the damn book came out in the 1990s. People my age, people in their 40s, especially women, are reading Harry Potter, or they're reading novels or some BS like that. Truth, reality is a lot more horrifying than fiction, and people are reading fiction instead of having a better comprehension as to the realities of the horrors of the world. And the reason why I stress so much importance on this is because when we have a better grasp of suffering and the realities that people around us are truly suffering, then we appreciate our lives more. We begin to have a deeper comprehension as to what it means to actually hold on to our time and to embrace our time and to also appreciate the blessings that God has given us. The fact that we have 2 arms and 2 eyes and have 2 legs and we can walk around and not worry about getting hit by cluster bombs or white phosphorus. Because that's exactly what the hell happened in Lebanon in the 1980s. So, to give some background, there were tribal and ethnic tensions between the Maronite Christian population in Lebanon in the 1970s and the Palestinian population. Now, tensions between Shiites and Sunnis in Lebanon go back a long ways. But after the Israelis defeated the Arab population in the West Bank, in the Holy Land, a lot of Palestinians went to Jordan and they went to Lebanon as refugees. And, of course, ethnic tensions and conflicts began. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, the Palestinians are totally innocent, and I'm not going to sit here and say the Lebanese Maronites are all totally innocent either. So please, spare me your BS narratives about what really happened in the war, and you're wrong, and the Maronites are totally innocent, and you just hate Christians or something like that, because it's just complete BS, and just spare me that stuff, okay? I don't want to hear your LARPing as a crusader. I don't want to hear about it. So, the Phalange and the Palestinians, the Phalangists were a paramilitary group that their founding was inspired by Adolf Hitler himself. But the Phalange and the PLO began to kill each other, and you also had far left Palestinian militants that were also involved. You had the PFLP, and then you had the Popular Front to Liberate Palestine was what it stood for. And you had a number of other militant groups. And then you also had left-wing Lebanese gunmen who sided with the Palestinians to fight against the Maronites, or really the Phalange, who they saw as fascists. So essentially it was anti-fascist Middle Eastern militants versus fascist Middle Eastern militants, okay? This was an intra-Middle Eastern Semitic war. Basically, it's almost like you could say it was kind of like all the wars that you read about in Europe in the Middle Ages, you know, different kings and counts killing each other and landlords and nobles, you know, killing each other. That's kind of like what was happening in Lebanon in the 1970s and 80s. So Syria gets involved because the Syrians, understandably so, were worried that the fighting would eventually overflow into Syria. Kind of like how the chaos in Iraq overflowed into Syria, or actually vice versa. Chaos in Syria overflowed into Iraq. But you know, you get the idea. So the Syrians invaded Lebanon, and they sent in this huge military force into that country. And for about 6 years, Syria was occupying much of Lebanon and fighting the PLO, and they were also fighting the Phalange. Israel really didn't seem to care that much because Israel also hated the PLO. But then something happened. Anwar Sadat, the leader of Egypt, made a deal with the Israelis, and then people started hating Israel a lot more, and then the Syrians began to back the PLO. Okay, so now Israel went into Lebanon, had a war with the Syrians, defeated the Syrians, and then occupied southern Lebanon. Okay. So the Israelis began to fight the PLO in a very, very vicious war, and the people who suffered the most, more than anyone, were the average Lebanese civilians who really didn't like the PLO themselves and just wanted to be left the hell alone. What ended up happening was the Israelis began to bomb the hell out of civilian populations in Lebanon using cluster bombs and white phosphorus. Now, for those of you who don't know the effects of white phosphorus, for one thing, it's against international law to use white phosphorus. And if you see the effects of white phosphorus on a civilian population, you'll see people literally burning alive, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's kind of like the blue fire that the Turks used on the Christians in Egypt during the Crusade of St. Louis. They would hit the French Crusader knights with arrows tipped with blue fire, and if one of those arrows hit you, you were dead. Like, you could jump into the Nile River and you would burn alive. That's pretty much what white phosphorus is. So you would see babies burning alive, and some guy would pick the baby up and, you know, immerse the child in water to try to extinguish the flames, and the baby's still burning alive, and the baby dies. It was really, really, absolutely horrific what was happening in Lebanon at this time. So, in one particular event, last night I was reading this book, and I'm telling you, I had to put the book down a couple of times because it was so horrifying. At one point in time, believe it or not, I was able to read these types of things, but now I can't, okay? I think because something happened to me once I turned 30. Like a few weeks after I turned 30, something clicked in my brain, and I became not a different person, but I kind of discovered a new side of myself where I'm like super compassionate and like super aware of suffering around me. I mean, I'm not saying I was a cold-hearted person before, but it's like, it's even deeper now. And I used to watch violent videos. I used to watch, when I used to do research on ISIS and things like that, you know, the Mexican cartels, you would run into these execution videos and you would see them. And I was disturbed by them, but I would, you know, watch them and be like, man, it's really horrifying. But, you know, that was it. But now I watch them and it's like, I can't watch them. I can't watch these videos anymore. I can't read stuff like this without challenging myself to read them. But I was reading this book by Robert Fisk, and Robert Fisk describes this bombing that he witnessed. And so he was in this neighborhood in Beirut, and an Israeli fighter jet comes in, flies over the neighborhood, and drops a big old bomb, big fat bomb. Drops a bomb on a neighborhood that was a quarter of a mile away from the nearest Syrian tank, and which was blocks away from the nearest PLO settlement, the nearest PLO spot. And a building gets hit, 100 people in the building dead. And he writes about how he saw a man sitting down, screaming in agony, screaming in utter agony, because his wife was underneath the rubble. A pregnant woman, shrieking, screaming in utter pain because her husband was dead in the building. And then Robert Fisk talks about how he saw, after the effects of one particular bombing, babies on the floor dead, people on the floor without limbs, people on the floor with no legs, torsos, arms, legs. And the woman who was screaming because her husband was killed, the pregnant woman, moments later, a car bomb erupts. I think 2 car bombs erupt. And Robert Fisk doesn't say who did the car bomb. It could have been the Shiites, it could have been the Sunnis, I don't know. But there was a car bomb that erupted. And the impact of the explosion was close enough to this pregnant woman who had just lost her husband, who was shrieking because she had just lost her husband. It was close enough to her that it took her head off, severed her head, decapitated her. I think a piece of rubble hit her and it just chopped her head off. Sheer and utter horror. The Canadian ambassador to Lebanon was seeing what was happening. And he himself said he was utterly disturbed by this. He himself said that he saw things that he thought the Israelis would never do. He said that he even went so far as to say, this is not the Israel that I thought I knew. These aren't the Israelis that I knew. Ronald Reagan's representative in Lebanon, his name was Philip Habib. He was utterly disturbed by what he was witnessing. He gave a call to Ariel Sharon, and he told Sharon to stop the bombing. And Ariel Sharon said, we're not bombing civilians. What are you talking about? And Philip Habib put the phone up in the air, and he said, do you not hear the bombs going off in the middle of Beirut? And Ariel Sharon said, oh, no, we're not bombing anyone. And the way Philip Habib recounted this was quite disturbing. He said that Ariel Sharon told him that what he was seeing was not happening, that what he saw was not occurring, an utter attempt at trying to manipulate reality. Complete horror, complete and utter horror. And then you have the pilots. Robert Fisk, a number of years after that event, went to Tel Aviv and interviewed one of the pilots who bombed Beirut. He was an Israeli pilot who was living in Tel Aviv. Very nice guy, very hospitable. Gave Mr. Fisk cake and tea. And he began to explain how, yes, we did bomb areas where civilians were. We didn't want to kill civilians, but we did it. We did so by accident, he said, because we were only ordered to strike at enemy positions. And Robert Fisk explained, well, you certainly didn't hit areas all the time that were just terrorist positions. You hit areas where there were no terrorists, where it was just a bunch of regular people living in an apartment building. And he said, well, yes, those things did happen, but they happened by accident. And Fisk said, well, don't you guys have pinpoint accuracy? Because the Israelis were boasting about how they had the ability to hit targets with pinpoint accuracy. And these Israeli pilots said, actually, no, we didn't really use a computer. And Fisk said, well, how did you aim at your target? How did you determine the target? And he said, well, when we were being briefed before the mission, they would give us these photographs of the buildings that we were supposed to hit. And so as we were flying these planes, we would just hold up the photo and then look down and look at the photo and look down and see which building looked like the one in the photograph. And they were hitting civilian targets. They were Israelis who were like, this is way too much. This is BS. They were Israelis who protested this stuff. I'm not singling out Israel. Like, oh, Israelis were doing... No, there were plenty of Israelis who knew that this was BS. But I'm not here to cause animosity towards Israel. And I'm not here to praise the PLO because I won't, because the PLO are a bunch of terrorists. The reason why I am bringing this description to you, this graphic description to you, is to give you guys the realities of war and violence. Because there are a lot of people who are playing soldier. There are a lot of people who are going to the forest playing tree jockey and shooting trees, thinking, oh, America is going to come to a civil war. America is going to come to us. We're going to have to fight a civil war to protect my Constitution and my America and my liberty, because some old guy and some Jamaican Indian woman is the vice president, or it looks like that's what it's going to be. I could be wrong. Trump could pull something off his sleeve. I don't know. But they are people who are fantasizing about civil war as if they're going to go play Civil War on the weekend, and then the rest of the week they're going to go to work. Once you start a civil war, there's no going back, guys. For those of you who are fantasizing about civil war, once you start a civil war, there is no going back. Because even after you guys have a peace treaty and the terms are set and the fighting pretty much stops, the effects of civil war will still be there. The psychological effects, the moral effects, the civil effects, it's all going to be there, and it's going to be very difficult to get rid of. We are still dealing with the impact of the Civil War, the American Civil War in this country. We are still dealing with, especially if you go to southern states. You can still see the effects of the Civil War. The fact that you can go to Virginia and people are still flying the Confederate flags, people are still harbor animosity towards Yanks and Northerners, the fact that you have areas of the South that have tremendous poverty and that are just kind of abandoned or kind of neglected as, oh, those are just southern backwater people. Listen, I used to live in California, and I can tell you right now, Californians, a lot of them, have very snobby attitudes towards southerners. Oh, those people are white trash. Oh, those people are racist. Oh, those people are just backwards, backwater folks, not like us sophisticated northern folks. So the biases and the effects of the American Civil War between the North and the South still linger in the atmosphere. It's why, for example, when you listen to major media outlets that are liberal-owned or that are left-wing leaning, they talk about what? Oh, those Southerners down there. Oh, yes, they're real backwards. Because the tensions between Northerner and Southerner in the United States is still alive and well. Just like when you go to Italy, there is still tension between Northern Italians and Southern Italians. So it's very real. Once you start a civil war, there literally is no going back. So when you fantasize about war and you're thinking about, you know, running around with a machine gun and an American flag up your ass, wandering around acting like you're Mr. Captain America playing tree jockey, actually sit down and read about the realities of war. Maybe it'll penetrate your empty brain. Because when you read about Civil War, when you read about any Civil War, they're all bloody. Like, oh, the Lebanese Civil War was horrible. They're all horrible. There's no Civil War that's one exception to another. They all suck. They're all horrific. I spoke to a guy who fought in the Yugoslav War. The Yugoslav War, in a way, was kind of like a civil war. Yugoslavia was one country under one government, a central government. Yes, it began to decentralize, but nonetheless, it was still technically Yugoslavia. And the Albanians in Kosovo, and the Bosnians, and the Croats, they all wanted to secede, just like the South wanted to secede. And they had a war between the Yugoslav military and their own respective militaries. And they had paramilitary groups, and they had militias, and they had all sorts of stuff. And they were killing each other, and thousands upon thousands of people ended up being killed. Civilians ended up being killed. And then NATO comes along and bombs the hell out of the Serbs, and the effects of that bombing are still in the Balkans. The effects of that war are still in the Balkans, even though they're not killing each other right now, even though, yes, Bosnia is independent, Croatia is independent, Slovenia is independent, you know, Kosovo is independent. The effects of that war that happened in the 1990s, decades ago, are still in the political atmosphere. They're still there. And guess what? They could literally start killing each other any day. Like, you could wake up in the morning and turn the TV on, or the YouTube on, because no one uses television anymore, and literally, you would be shocked. Oh, yes, Serbs and Croats are killing each other again. Kosovars and Serbs are killing each other again. It's like a revolution. Once you start a revolution, guess what? The chances of another revolution taking place are very real. The prospect of another revolution taking place are very real. It's why France has had like 3 or 4 freaking revolutions. Had the 18th century revolution, the 18th century revolution that everyone talks about, but then there were a whole bunch of other revolutions that happened in France within the 1800s. Mexico's had a number of revolutions. So, you know, that's why you have people like Steve Bannon coming along and saying, well, you know, the American Revolution was great. Let's have another one. These people are all operatives. They're terrorists. These people are literal ideological freaking terrorists. So the thing is that when the war broke out in Yugoslavia, they all started killing each other. I spoke to a guy who fought in that war in the 1990s. He was a very fascinating character, very intelligent guy, fought for the Yugoslav military. And he told me, listen, because all these people are fantasizing about, like, well, you know, it would be the conservative, moral people versus the evil, heathenistic left-wingers. When a civil war erupts, both sides become heathens, for the most part. When a civil war erupts, both sides become heathens. Because this former Yugoslav veteran told me that, that the Albanians, they weren't just killing Serbs. They were killing other Albanians. Because it wasn't about religion, and it wasn't about ideology. It was about money. Because they were killing other Albanians and taking their organs and selling them in the freaking black market. So, if you want to live a peaceful life, then just deal with the current situation. Look at Grandpa Biden and Mama Kamala and have a laugh. Even if Trump doesn't make it in the White House, laugh at Mama Kamala and old Grandpa George, and deal with it for 4 years, because Biden's not going to last that long anyway. And then we'll elect another guy. Complain about the president? Go ahead. Criticize the government? Go ahead. But whatever your complaints are, they're not worth spilling blood in the streets. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.